My name is Jason.
And my name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we've got to get up to get down in the Dark Tower of Cabilar.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
The Dark Tower of Cabilar is the first adventure in the first issue of Dungeon magazine, published in 1988. It was written by Michael Ashton and Lee Sperry, and we believe the art is by Jim Holloway. It certainly looks that way, although it's not entirely clear from the magazine's credits. From the intro text. 4 years ago, the sprawling city of Stout Wall was a haven for people who wanted peace and quiet. Then the throne was usurped by a magic user named Cabilar. The wizard slew the entire city council with a cloud kill, then blasted the king with a lightning bolt. However, the king's aged personal attendant was wearing a necklace of adaptation and managed to escape the slaughter through a secret door leading to the king's chamber. Guessing Cabilar's motives, he hastened to the prince's bedroom and bade the adolescent heir come. Together they dashed through forgotten corridors and emerged outside the castle walls. The prince's saviour brought him by back roads to his godparents. At that point, the strain became too much for the old loyalist, who had a heart attack and died. But, as he collapsed, he gave the prince one item saved from the sack of the palace, the symbol of the kingship, a jade crown. When Cabilar discovered that the prince was missing, he had the city scoured, but to no avail, as the prince had been spirited away with his godparents accompanying him. However, after 2 days' travel northward, the prince's godfather was slain, and the crown which he protected stolen by a vampire. The prince and his godmother found shelter in a neighbouring city, where they have remained these 4 years. Now that the prince is old enough to win back his city, it is time that the crown be brought forward. After much research, the lair of the vampire has been found. The prince's godmother has commissioned you to get the crown. She has discovered that the lair of the vampire is, interestingly enough, in the same tower that was inhabited by Cabilar before his conquest. She promises to pay each and every member of the expedition a generous reward when the mission is complete.
The adventure starts with the party arriving at the tower of this vampire, which is actually a massive, hollowed-out stalagmite in a titanic cave. After a perilous climb to the top windows, in which they must deal with some nasty fire drakes, the characters slip inside and descend into a 3-level dungeon with 45 keyed locations. Some highlights of those keyed locations are a classic checkerboard floor chamber with a treasure on the other side. Some of the squares are rigged with traps, naturally. A room called Utopia, filled with beautiful murals and resting chairs and magical enchantments. A long corridor lined with orc snipers. The Corridor of Darkness, in which magical smoke dampens your senses, thoughts, and emotions. And Wraithland. Ultimately, the party will face the master of the house, the cold-eyed vampire Yatel Etes. I will note here that a key part of this dungeon is finding a magic item called the Ring of Night, which functions as a ring of protection, but is mostly a MacGuffin you have to toss into a lava pit in order to gain access to the aforementioned prince's crown. Let's go to our bona fides, Tom.
I have read this carefully and made notes. How about you?
I have also read it carefully and made notes, but I've also run it over the course of 3 sessions using Trophy Gold. I'll note highly adapted. I summarized and cut out great big parts of this to make it work for the time I had, but also just using my own judgment of what I thought would be fun, which segues nicely into things we liked about the Dark Tower of Cabilar. It's fine.
Yes, it's aggressively fine is how I would describe it.
Yeah, it's fine. It's not bad. I chose to do this because it was the first dungeon in the first issue of Dungeon Magazine. I thought that was kind of novel. This is also our first episode of the new year, or Chinese New Year, at least at this point now. And so I thought an episode of First would be a lot of fun as well. There's something fun about doing an adventure that has this distinction, right, I guess, in time. And it's not bad, but it's just so D&D, isn't it?
It is very D&D. I think maybe what's interestingly historically about it is it's the first issue of Dungeon Magazine, first adventure. But this is, what was it, 88? It's already very well established. And the thing that sort of gets me immediately is that it's already got these sort of slightly clunky ways of describing things or not describing things, just referring to magic items by their names and not
Cloud Kill and Lightning Bolt.
Yeah. But having said that, to segue this back into the segment and things that we like, I will say, although the main body text is a lot like that 80s D&D stuff, the box text I think has some good turns of phrase in various places and seems to be quite clear as well if you're going to use it, and really highlights the things that the players need to immediately grasp, which is what we like, but is also sometimes has little bits of poetry in it, which is good. No complaints I think about that. But I gotta say, it doesn't leap off the page at me, this one.
I think we both agree that the best part is the climb, right? This is the best part of the dungeon. It's the best part on the page, and it's the best part when you actually play it. The characters have to climb this enormous stalagmite, which is the tower, and then they have to get inside because it has windows and then go down. But the climb is fun because it's surrounded by these fire drakes, and so you have this quite perilous situation as you're trying to scale the stalagmite. That was very enjoyable in play. What did you think about that from a read?
Yeah, that was the thing that jumped out at me when I started reading. And there's something quite compelling, isn't there, about that paradox of having to climb up so that you can climb down again and then get below the tower. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. And then I read the 3 fairly standard dungeon levels beyond.
Then you get to the tower,
but yeah, I think the tower is the best bit. It sort of catches the imagination much more than the rest. The rest of it seems a bit more like a adventure playground than an adventure. Like Wraithland, you mentioned. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's just a room with a wraith in it, isn't it?
It is, yes. Yeah. It is indeed just a room with a wraith.
Yeah. But that being said, there are fun bits in it. Like there's some business with a revolving wall, which is quite hard to move. So sometimes you could trap yourself on the wrong side of it or not, and it reveals different rooms. It feels like the vibe I got from it was that it was quite well laid out. There are different ways to get into each room, but each set piece feels like a little puzzle for everyone to solve. And but I mean, is that because of course you're running this by kind of ignoring the bits you don't like? So how did you feel about that when you brought it to the table?
I had to really do some adaptation for Trophy Gold because this dungeon is such a classic dungeon in that it is mostly just a hodgepodge of unfair traps and random monsters. Yeah. The traps are kind of unfair in my opinion. Like there's the one trap that is like a spear trap, like a floor spear trap, in front of the door, and then you open the door and there's nothing inside, like I don't know. I hate bullshit like that, right?
Yeah.
It's a different time, like I get it. But I mostly, when I was adapting it, I picked the 3 or 4 like really good set pieces, and there are some really good set pieces here. And I just sort of hand waved or allowed the Trophy Gold to do its thing to kind of get through the boring parts, just kind of summarizing the crawl part of the dungeon crawl, just so we could get to the fun parts. The little utopia area with the enchantments and the murals is really, really cool. And actually, the murals are really neat because the murals give you some clues about what's going on in the dungeon, which is quite helpful. Yeah. The ring is cool. The ring is kind of stupid because you have to destroy the ring to finish the dungeon. It's a little cheap. But the idea that the ring leads you to the crown is kind of fun. And I played with that a little bit. The monster encounters are whatever. To me, this dungeon, when they wrote it, it feels like they had like one really solid, indeed great idea, which is the stalagmite tower. Yeah. And then they were like, and now we got to populate it with orcs
with more dungeon
and stuff like that. With more dungeon stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree about the ring, actually. So one thing I like about the ring is that as an idea, so it's a magic ring, and it has these sort of levels of power where if you're wearing it anywhere on the prime material plane, so basically anywhere, it's just a magic ring that gives you a +1 to something, whatever. But specifically if you're in the dungeon, and if you're in specific levels of the dungeon, it becomes more powerful. I think that's a really fun bad guy magic item. It might be a fun PC magic item to have. I think that's not an idea I think I've really seen before, and I might steal that for something else. That was good. But also to come back to your idea of being the ring leading you through and mentioning, is it the paintings in the Utopia room?
There's like these murals in the
Utopia. There's lots of foreshadowing and connections to give you a bit of a warning, so that having paintings telling you what might happen or what's waiting for you, that's been used to good effect in later adventures, like the Sea Queen Escapes for Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Right.
When you arrive, there's the big mosaic of the...
That's a good shout, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good technique to note here, I think. And also, there are lots of nice bits of clues from previous interlopers. Like you can find the body of an adventurer. Actually, that doesn't have anything on it. The clue that adventurer left behind is somewhere else. But I liked that the entry for it notes which dead body left that clue for you. Because you know what players are like? Sometimes they're going to be determined to find out like through magic or whatever it means. So at least the author has said to the GM, it's this guy. And what else? It's also quite free with ways to get information. So like there's a password you can say to find an easy way through a trapdoor at one point, and it just says there's a bunch of different ways they could find this out through magic or through knowing this or that. And I think that's good. It doesn't make it into an insurmountable barrier. There is also a way to do it without knowing the password. So in that sense, I think it's very much atypical of what we think of as like the bad old days dungeon design.
Bad old days dungeon. Yeah. So, no, I agree with that.
So yeah, I think it does have these good bits. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, those are good notes. And I can see that, especially thinking back on it now. I don't think when I was reading it or when I played it, that was like so much front of my mind. But I was also trophy golding away a lot of the stuff. And maybe I should have given it more credit. One of the set pieces I really enjoyed that my group didn't actually do, but on paper I really like it, is the Corridor of Darkness. I think that's one of the better parts of this, because it's like not just magical darkness, it's this smoke that also dampens your thoughts and emotions. And I wish my group had gotten to that, but we were running out of time and we kind of skipped a big portion of that level. I kind of wish we'd done it, because a game like Trophy Gold that really lets you collaboratively decide what bad could happen here, like that's a terrific set piece for such a rule. You're in the smoke that dampens your emotions. What could go wrong here? That's a fantastic question. But I like it on paper, and I think that would be fun in a more traditional game too. Yeah, Dark Tower of Cabilar, first dungeon of the first issue of Dungeon Magazine. I think everyone should give it a look just for historical purposes, if nothing else. Yeah. It's not a bad dungeon. It's got its moments, some good set pieces, but also a hodgepodge of monsters and traps. So.
We should also mention that we think Jim Holloway art. I think it's quite characterful. I think the illustration of the vampire and the skeletons, they all look very pleased that you've arrived.
Yeah, it's really good. I like the little tower illustration too. The little like hazy stalagmite illustration is pretty cool. Anything else you want to throw out for you?
No, really. I think it's some nice bits to plunder from an otherwise. It feels mean. It's the way it's sort of shackled by its need to be a standard adventure in the first issue of Dungeon Magazine, isn't it? But it's definitely worth a look, as you say.
Well, let's go to questions we had. Tom, you got a few here.
I got a few. I mean, well, I think I mentioned earlier, I hate this stuff with like that intro, for example, where it's the wizard slew the city council. It actually has the italicized spell names with a lightning bolt and a necklace of adaptation. Like this is so unevocative to me. I don't know, man.
Imagine reading one of those wretched Drizzt Do'Urden novels where, which, I mean, they're fun in their way, but they're not good. Where, like, they don't even tell you what things are. They just, like, assume you know the D&D.
Yeah.
And, like, just say the names of things.
What?
Like, it's that idea, right? You have to know D&D, right?
It is a bit. And also, I think, and that's something I do wonder about is have they correctly calibrated this? Because part of the function of Dungeon Magazine Adventure is to sell players' handbooks and so on. And I think to do that, you want to have a few things that refer to rules that are only in the rulebook, but that are tantalizing enough to make you sort of imagine what it probably is and then want to find out for sure. Whereas a lot of this stuff, it was opaque to me and I didn't care. And I think that may have been, I don't know. But I think there is a balancing act to do there. Sometimes you want to be a bit mysterious about what you're talking about in this kind of thing. Because these were on like newsagent shelves, right? You could buy these magazines and then maybe want to get the game, you know?
Yeah, it definitely is like, you better know D&D or this part is not going to make any sense. But it's of the time, right? It's just of the time. Okay, what's your next question?
Well, my next one is, as we said, it doesn't leap off the page, but there is something to be said for, I think, maybe the dungeon being less interesting than the players and the characters. Was that how it panned out for you at the table? Was it interesting enough anyway?
Yeah, but by a lot. We've been low-key criticizing this classic dungeonness, but I think there's something there. I am a big believer, a big proponent, and sometimes the predictable or the easy thing in a role-playing game can actually create space for some really cool moments because you all get to get on the same page in your heads really quickly. Yeah. Once you get inside the stalagmite, it's a pretty bog-standard dungeon crawl, and the traps are like super obvious. The checkerboard floor room. Everyone, you see that room, you know exactly what's going on. Some of these squares are going to have traps. The treasure is literally in plain sight on the other side of the chamber, right up against the wall. It's like a video game. But there's something nice about that because players like get it. There's not a lot of having to like get your various headcanons in order to do the scene. You get it, you know what's going on, and so you can kind of just sink into your character and have fun with it. So there's something to that. Yeah, I agree.
Nice. And did you have a question or observation?
I do. I feel like the best part of this dungeon is actually spoiled, which is you don't actually have to find the stalagmite tower. You start at the stalagmite tower and it tells you straight away that's the tower and you have to go climb it. When I was reading it, I was like, no, this is the best part. I think the player should have to discover that is the tower. And so that's what I did. I did a little preamble part of the adventure, which is also probably why I went long when I was running it. But I did a little preamble adventure where they thought it was a traditional masoned tower on a hill. And then they got to the hill and it's a cave and they had to like discover like, oh, it's the stalagmite. That's the tower. And that was a cool moment. Like it was a really cool moment when the players figured that out. Right. And so not a question, just a,
no, that's nice. That, I think
I was a little bummed that was the best part and they kind of ruined it.
Yeah,
So.
I think, you could even do a little, the classic village plus dungeon setup.
Oh, that's what we did.
Yeah, good stuff.
All right. Well, then let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom.
Quoting from one of the monster encounters, in the centre of the room is a 13-foot tall humanoid with 2 heads. One head seems to be asleep. The other head sees your party and bellows. I don't know, I just like something about them both being not doing the same thing all the time. Yeah.
It's a good character, too. Not from the adventure itself, but the Dungeon Magazine cover illustration of Flame the Red Dragon is absolutely iconic, probably one of the most iconic Dungeons & Dragons images. And there's this little blurb on the credits page which says, "Every silver lining has its cloud," as Keith Parkinson shows in his portrait of Flame from Into the Fire, which is one of the other adventures. Keith researched the treasures in Flame's hoard, borrowing from actual 14th through 18th century treasures in Europe. The enraged Flame, of course, is pure Keith.
Pure Keith. Okay, the next one from the sort of the boss monster encounter, I guess you could call it. Yataletes, the vampire, doesn't mind talking while engaged in melee. In fact, he rather enjoys a certain level of repartee under pressure.
The box text of Utopia, "This room is colored with murals on every wall, depicting all sorts of scenes from the life of a great wizard. Beautiful paper rose bushes are under every pillar, of which there are 10. The pillars are made of smooth white marble. A lovely fountain adorns the southwestern corner, forming a little pool. Several reclining chairs rest at various places in the little Utopia. The ceiling appears to be black obsidian studded with chips of mica, giving the impression of a clear night sky."
In the corridor of darkness, the smoke seems to have a dampening effect on your other senses as well, and even your thoughts and emotions seem to have a blanket over them.
Finally, there is a room entitled Chimera Little Closer. It has a chimera in it. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve, and our topic is missing a player? Don't cancel your play session. It's our first podcast of the year, and I wanted to do a topic that encourages people to get to the game table more frequently in 2025. And I don't know about you, Tom, but one of the biggest impediments I see out there in social media land of role-playing games, and that I myself occasionally fall prey to, is that you feel like you have to cancel your whole session just because 1 or 2 people can't make it that week. Listeners, don't do that. There is no reason to cancel your session just because someone is missing. We are going to talk about some strategies.
Yeah. Jason, I could not agree more. I just want to say that up the top of this whole discussion. It is the death knell for games.
It is.
To do this. You must.
And it doesn't have to be. Yeah.
No, it's so important to maintain momentum and to have things on a timetable. And, if you've got a weekly game, do it every week. And we'll come into how you can make that work. But once you start cancelling, you're going to keep cancelling. And you're never going to get out of it. And I've seen it happen so many
snowballs.
times. Yeah.
And I think the reason why it happens, people on the face of it are like, oh, well, we're missing a player, so we obviously can't keep the story going because we don't have one of the characters. And I think that that's the notional reason for canceling, and indeed that's what our topic here is going to address. I do think to some degree there's a certain little serotonin boost you get from knowing you don't have to go be at the place at the time that you thought you were going to have to be at, And so
is there any greater joy than getting a text so you don't something's been cancelled that you
don't have to get dressed and go somewhere, yeah. But here's the thing, listeners. Forget that serotonin boost. Playing a role-playing game is an even bigger boost. You're going to have so much fun. Just do it. And Tom's right. You start canceling sessions for this reason, and then you just never get it back together, and then boom, there goes your big plan. It's the beginning of the year, still Chinese New Year as of this recording. For this year, we are going to have a resolution of getting to the table, and we're not going to let this stop us. There are a number of strategies and specific techniques you can employ to account for a missing character. And furthermore, these techniques and strategies don't have to be a compromise. Indeed, in some instances, a missing player can be an opportunity to accomplish things in the story and campaign that you've been kind of neglecting up to that point. So that's one big idea I would like for people to keep in mind. This can be an opportunity if you handle it right. That's my sort of high-level thought. I also want to note here before we dive in too much that my advice, at least, is pretty strictly for your classic fantasy adventure gaming, but can be adapted pretty easily to any game that is campaign length or more than a few sessions.
I suppose the first thing to consider is, the idea of, we must have the complete party at all times. And we'll get into reasons why that might be trickier than otherwise for either in or out of character reasons. But if you think about most serial forms of storytelling, TV shows, not every character is in every episode,
right,
most of the time, and that still works. And sometimes in real life, we go and do stuff and someone isn't able to go, and that also happens. And so sometimes it can be as simple as they're just not there. For out-of-character reasons, of course, there is the issue, and we're going to talk about this, I think. And in some ways, I think maybe the biggest issue is that if the player's not there, regardless of what their character was doing, they have to be brought up to speed on things they need to know
right,
when they get back. Without doing a blow-by-blow of the whole session or sessions that they missed. And you might want to do that all in one, between sessions, at the beginning of the next session, or maybe sometimes a little bit spaced out because you don't have time for everything and you have to do little updates of, we forgot to mention we saw Bigfoot out in the woods that time we went to the farm. But overall, I don't think it's that big a deal. It's not. But let's talk about how to make it even less of a deal.
Without sounding too trite, it is really not a big deal to have a missing player. But that's what we're going to talk about. I have ways of mitigating the complications of it. I want to start with the love letter. So I'm sure we've talked about love letters on this show before, but just to do so again here. The love letter is a technique that was developed by the Bakers for Apocalypse World. And I'm probably not going to get it exactly right here, but this is what they've come to mean. What they've come to mean is it's something that you write for the missing player to get them up to speed. It's called a love letter because the way it was originally presented, it was like, dear player, while you were gone, hugs and kisses your GM or your MC or your whatever. Over time, the way it developed, at least as far as I can tell, and the way I indeed use them, is it's developed to not just be this while you were gone thing, but also it's to sort of explore what we think your character was doing while you were gone. While you were gone, maybe your character got up to this. And so the way I've used love letters is, and I don't really even write them down anymore. I just kind of keep them in my head and just say, but you can write them down. The way I've used love letters is to say, okay, while the characters were all off at this part of the adventure, you were over here. And this is what you encountered. This is what you saw. And now you're going to roll some dice to see how that went. And then I attach some mechanics to it. And then the player gets to roll some dice to see what they accomplished with their character while they were off screen. It's a really fantastic technique, as I've described it at least, because it gets the character caught up. It explains away their absence from the group. And it puts some gaminess into it too. You get a little game part. You get some mechanics you get to engage with in order to accomplish something. So you feel like you're still contributing as a character, right? You're still contributing even though your character wasn't there. And it's a pretty fantastic and indeed thoughtful way to account for the character, to get them caught up. And importantly, and this gets to what I was hinting at earlier about it not being a compromise, it's an opportunity for a character to do something off screen that has been of interest to the party, but has perhaps been ignored up until this point. Especially like in a campaign that's been going for a minute. You've got that old lady in the woods that we know is there. We never got a chance to talk to her. Or we told that one farmer we'd go check into why his cows keep wandering off the land. That's a horrible example, but like there's something, right? There's some little thing in the setting, some little thing that like we just don't have time to deal with, but we know it's a thing and it can be handled off screen. It's an opportunity to look in, to check in on that stuff. It's off screen, but it's a chance to bring it into your story and give it some meaning. And this is really particularly important in a fantasy game where It's not super linear, and you do have a living, breathing world with things going on. Thoughts about the love letter, Tom?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the love letter. I've even used them to start games or campaigns as well. Like each person chooses a thing. So before this started, you were doing this or that.
Exactly.
And in fact, I do think, well, in my games and historically, I think it's actually what you were doing is the key. You could even leave out the catching up part, but I think it's good to use it for the catching up on what the group were up to while you were away as well. I will advocate for a couple of things actually within a love letter. One is do write it down and send it to the player if you can before the game starts, because that way you're not just delivering a bunch of information and asking them to do the next part, which is make decisions on the spot. Rather, it's a bit more like, you know how, well, I think we may have discussed this. One of the good things about play-by-post games is you get a chance to really think about what your character's going to do and come up with the perfect answer. And so this is an opportunity for that player who's just missed out on a couple of hours at least of the game to come back in, and they're armed with their spotlight time. They've read the options, because I think mechanically you either want it to be a dice roll with some options afterwards, or just a straight choice. Like maybe you went to the mountains and spoke to the dwarves. Maybe you spent time in town and blah, blah, blah. And that way
it's like a little choose your own adventure thing, kind of.
Exactly, a little bit, just like a one choice thing. I obviously do the dice roll, if any, with everyone around. But by allowing them time to prepare, this is their moment in the spotlight right at the top of the show. Hey guys, I'm back. What were you doing? Well, I went to the mountains. How did it go? Let's find out. Let's roll the dice and see what happened. And I think it's really good if they're prepped and ready to go. And it's a great way to reunite everyone. And as you say, to explore side stories, but also to emphasize what that character is like.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to kind of give that player to do some internal character work, right? Like kind of let them spotlight what they're all about.
Yeah, they're really, really good. Great. Love letters are, I think, I'll be honest, I often forget about them for months at a time and then don't use them for ages, but every time I come back to them, but they're pretty good.
They're super helpful, yeah. And again, it's a proactive, satisfying way of dealing with a character's absence, because a character's absence doesn't have to be a compromise. I will note that the way you handle it does depend quite a lot on a few different factors, or it can. I mostly play online, and I put my videos up on YouTube, and so missing players can go see what happened in the game, so I don't have to do as much of the catch-up part, and that's also why I spring the love letter on them in the moment. I agree with Tom, though. If you are playing face-to-face, you should definitely give the player the love letter beforehand. I will note here that the love letter is most helpful in situations where the party isn't all confined to a small space, like a dungeon. It works best if the other character could possibly not be with the group. It's a little trickier if you are smack dab in the middle of a dungeon or in an otherwise geographically or even temporally restricted part of the adventure. In other words, just when it's not easy to explain away why they're not there. It's trickier. It's a trickier situation, to be sure, but not impossible. I have a few strategies here. I'll kind of rattle them off. Okay, we're in a dungeon. It's session 3 of the dungeon, and Joe is not here this week because fucking Joe, right? And now we need to figure out... No, I'm not disparaging Joe. It's okay. Sometimes life happens. We get it. Joe's missing. How do we account for the character's absence? Well, is there a part of the dungeon that they could have slipped off to? This is pretty similar to the love letter technique. If there's a part of the dungeon where the characters saw it, there's a statue down the corridor. We'll go look at that in a minute. Let's go down this corridor instead. Well, in session 3, maybe Joe's character did go look at the statue, and so you can write a little love letter to handle that. That's a pretty straightforward way of doing it. Maybe you do a little die roll. You kind of summarize the encounter. It might be that they were resting or otherwise operating in the background. It's possible. Like Tom said earlier, we watch ensemble TV shows all the time when we don't see a particular character one week, even though we know they're there, and you don't think anything of it. You just assume they're in the background but not doing anything important in the story. You can do that sometimes in a dungeon. It's a little circumstantial, but I've done that where like the character's just hanging out, they're resting. It's a little easier if there's a reason why they might not be actively engaged, like if they sustained an injury or something in the previous session or some kind of curse, and maybe they're in the background healing or dealing with that for that session, and that works great. It's a little hand wavy, but it's not the end of the world. It works fine. You can come up with something that vanishes them away, a hidden portal, a cursed object, something like that, and then you just handle it like a love letter.
Oh, yeah. The Scooby-Doo technique, isn't it? So the stairs turned into a slider now.
Precisely, yeah. Scooby-Doo it. This is actually a terrific opportunity to explore that mission critical or maybe mission interesting part of the dungeon that the players skipped earlier, right? So they didn't go into the little room where they have to get the one key they're going to need 3 chambers from now. Maybe the character got vanished away or Scooby-Dooed away to that location and they have a chance to find the key. It's a nice thing to keep the party on track. And again, not a compromise. It's actually benefiting the group. I think the most important thing, though, Tom, and tell me what you think of this, I think it's important that you don't dwell on it while you're playing. While you're playing, you don't dwell on why the character is missing. I think you just play without acknowledging the character's absence. You just play and then deal with it after the fact. I think that's important.
Yeah, like a post-facto explanation. They're not here this week. We'll figure that out later.
We'll figure it out later.
Although that being said, the other option I want to mention, which has been used extensively in many games I've played in, and run, I guess. And that's what my good friend Clayton used to refer to as the character being greyed out, as in like appearing in less bright colours than the characters that have active players in the session. And that's this idea that the character is there, just sort of in the background, as you mentioned, perhaps resting, nursing an injury, who can say, but definitely physically there, because every so often, if there's something in that character's backpack that you need, or they're the one that knows how to cast a spell that does a thing, they do it, and otherwise they're not really getting involved, which is sort of halfway between, like, not being there, but also it doesn't force you to deal with their absence, which could be a shame, because sometimes having to deal with the character's absence is a fun bit of a plot of a story.
Can be, yeah.
But if you're doing this grayed out thing, though, I think you need a little bit of a social contract, which is that it's always just for non-controversial uses of those things. If they've got, if you want to use the rope ladder, that's probably fine. Yeah. If you want to use their one flask of potion of
healing potion or whatever,
you sort of have to have a concord agreement in place that you're not going to even bring that up. That you're sort of, even if that potion might be super useful in the situation, I think you have to sort of carefully avoid even mentioning it, because that's the point where you will start to fret about it. Because as you say, the key is to just play, and sometimes people aren't there because they've gone away to look at the other side of the mountains, or they've got called to their actual day job instead of breaking into a library to investigate something. That can happen for in and out of character reasons. And you're right, the thing is, figure it out afterwards, between sessions. That's actually maybe that might be the one best tip out of all of these, I think, is
just play.
Keep playing, figure it out later.
Figure it out later. I actually like what you said about having the character there to use mission critical things that they have on their person. That this is especially the case where when we're doing a dungeon crawl, Joe's character always has the rope ladder, we always use his grappling hook to get to places. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. You're right about not using the character's stuff that is much more personal or to their character, or things that Joe might not be pleased about, maybe items that were hard to get a hold of or Joe paid a lot of money for. One thing you might want to do is when Joe says he's not going to be there, maybe at that point, just to make sure it's all really super clear, just be like, hey, do you mind if we use your character's stuff? If so, like, what can we use? You can maybe do that. Yeah. Maybe have Joe on the group chat while you're playing, and when it comes up, be like, hey, Joe, where this is happening, are we able to use this thing? Do you mind? Or whatever, right? You can that's easy to work around. I like, though, this idea of the grayed out character, especially if there's a reason why they might just be hanging back. I think that makes a lot of sense. But, you can also Scooby-Doo them away. if there's that's what I would do. To me, I'm always thinking about, damn, there's this part of the dungeon they didn't do, and now I've got a missing character. Oh, I'm getting that character over there, right? So we're gonna get that part of the dungeon done. I think we've done a pretty good job covering the single missing player. What if you have the annoying situation where a lot of people are missing and it's just you and one or two other people at the table? That's a different situation, I think. Yeah. It's handled differently.
Yeah. Honestly, a lot of the time, this is, you probably play something else for one week.
Play something else. Yeah. I mean, it's a chance to try another game, do a one-shot of something. I'd love for you to try Trophy Dark, for example. It's a great one-shot game. I think the more important thing here is you don't want to lose momentum. Like Tom said at the top, when you start canceling sessions, no matter the reason, it just spirals. And if you can just get together with your group of one other person or two people and just play something, I think that is just best.
Although
right?
the caveat that I think if you do that 2 or 3 times in a row, you're getting close to cancelling the previous.
You are.
Yeah,
I
so
know.
you should watch that. But yeah.
But I have a theory, though. I have a theory that and I've seen it, it's not a theory, I know it, it's true. If you steadfastly keep playing, even if someone is regularly missing or if a couple people are regularly missing, a lot of times those people who let life get in the way, they start to miss the fact that they're not playing. They start to get a little bit of FOMO about it, and they suddenly show back up at the table. There's really something to be said about powering through, getting to the table and playing to create this idea of, look, I'm still committed to playing this game, and yeah, we're still having fun. Maybe you should reschedule your thing that you suddenly have every Thursday, right?
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. Or the glass half empty version of that is they might just not come back. They might decide that the other thing is more important, and that's okay too, right?
And at least you have, if you're still meeting regularly, you've created like a group commitment to making it work and maybe finding another player. You have created a slightly different culture for your table. And I think that is really important. Before we get too far away from it, I do want to go back to this idea of there's just you and one other player, or you and maybe one or two other people. You could just do another game. I think that's not a bad idea. If your story will allow it, do a quick one-off side adventure with that character. This is where some of those one-page dungeons are super helpful. Something you don't have to spend a lot of time preparing. You just send this one character or two characters into a little small dungeon to do on the side that you can knock out in one session. Maybe you do a flashback adventure. This is a slightly more advanced technique, but you could do it.
I love
right?
this. This is going straight into my imaginary brain Rolodex of ideas for emergencies. Flashbacks are great because they don't...
It's great.
Yeah, you don't need anyone else around. You don't have to worry about the continuity, except obviously they don't die when they get to 0 HP, because...
Yeah.
Or unless they're a clone or something. But that's a great idea. Flashback is such a simple idea. And it could still be useful to the ongoing campaign. They could learn stuff. They could find a bit of treasure that they hadn't mentioned before that's like left. They could go and recover it in a future session. This is flashback. That's a great idea.
I love a flashback. I love a prologue. I love all that. This is beyond the scope of today's topic, but obviously there's well, how do you handle if the character dies in flashback or whatever? Well, you prepare a little bit ahead of time.
It just means the stakes are not going to. That's not going to be
are not super dangerous or deadly.
But it's still,
or they die, and then you just have them say, "So tell us what really happened. How'd you actually survive?" or something like that. Yeah. It's not a big deal. But no, I love a flashback adventure. I do that often, like when it's just me and one other person, and I'm really feeling like we need to get to the table. I'll be like, well, let's just do a little. You mentioned one time that your character's brother did X, so let's go do that. Let's do the Nathan Drake and his brother escaping from the nuns or whatever, right? Like, let's do it. The most important thing, I think, is just getting to the table. Don't let a missing player or even many missing players stop you from continuing to play, because there's this aspect of momentum. And if you just sit down and keep playing and don't worry too much about the missing player, you can always handle it after. There's loads of ways of dealing with it after the fact. In 2025, don't let that be the
year of the snake. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Anything else, Tom?
I think that's it.
Fantastic. Let's go to companion adventures. It's companion adventures. We both have a book. What's your book?
Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. She's the author of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I think that's her better known work. But this is a somewhat slimmer, less ornate work. And I can't really tell you much about this because it would be spoiler heavy. But I will say, here's a dungeon setting with a pretty good mechanism for characters to be coming and going. So definitely give it a read. I think it can be enjoyed by fans of dungeon fantasies and literary fiction alike. So yeah, check it out. Piranesi.
Keeping with the theme of today's episode, I have chosen The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which we have not recommended on this show.
Seems like we probably don't need to, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Well, I know. Fair enough. It's going to be a lot of people's first, at least in the English-speaking world, it's going to be a lot of people's first entry into the fantasy genre. I think if you're like me, listeners, you read The Hobbit or had it read to you when you were a kid, right? It is famously a children's book. Also, there also happens to be a quote from The Hobbit on the first page of the first issue of Dungeon Magazine, which is, "Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today." From Bilbo Baggins, of course. But also, I actually happen to have read this recently. I read it just a couple weeks ago, like 3 weeks ago. I hadn't read it in ages, probably since I was a kid, and it holds up.
It does. I read it with my son pretty recently, yeah.
It really holds up. Something I didn't know about it that I learned on this reread is that from when it was originally published in 1937, it was revised quite a lot in the ensuing years in order to account for the Lord of the Rings, which I think is really fascinating.
I don't know where the joins are. Because I'm not.
Yeah. Like parts of it were rewritten to make the Lord of the Rings make more sense, which I think is
the phrase,
something very
hiding to nothing springs to mind. But
there's something very like RPG about that, right? Like there's something very retconny about it. Yeah.
I thought that you were bringing this up because The Hobbit, of course, features one of the classic all-time one member of the party wandering off by themselves sequences.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. That didn't even occur to me. That literally didn't even occur to me, but you are right. The whole book is just Bilbo wandering off from the party, right? Like, Bilbo is just doing love letters nonstop, right?
Exactly. You met a weird goblin guy in a lake. What happened next?
Actually, it's the dwarfs who were getting the love letters. It was like, dear dwarfs, you all just sat around complaining about the cold and no food while,
Well, that is true, yeah. Bilbo's player keeps
While Bilbo
up.
did the adventure, right? Yeah. Right.
While we're recommending things that absolutely everyone listening to this has seen or read, I did want to mention the film Star Wars from 1977, which if you think about the bit where they are all on the Death Star, I'm not sure which pair of player characters actually showed up to that session because they all immediately split up and wander off into different rooms and get confused. So I think that's a pretty good model for the dungeon where people keep disappearing into different sections at the drop of a hat.
That's a great shout. I'd like to try this Star Wars.
The Star Wars, yes. It's quite the heady cocktail.
Fantastic. Listeners, that is our show. Mm-hmm. We are delighted to be back with you in 2025. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on gauntlet-rpg.com or on Blue Sky at Gauntlet RPG. You can also support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you as we enter the Year of the Snake to our Ophidian editor, Rich Rogers.
Fantastic. Thanks, listeners.